Our top story this morning, and that of course has all got to do with President's economic recovery and reconstruction plan. So job creation, re-industrializing the economy by strengthening small and medium businesses, fighting crime and corruption are just some of the four central pillars in President Ramaphosa's plan. Addressing a joint sitting of Parliament yesterday, the President tabled a range of interventions. These include government's plan to invest 100 billion rand in job creation over the next 3 years. Ramaphosa says government will create 800,000 jobs in the months ahead. The President also committed to prioritising Eskom to make the power utility a reliable energy generator. Enoch Godongwana is the ANC's head of economic transformation, and he joins us now to discuss this. Mr. Godongwana, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
An absolute pleasure. So, to what extent does the recovery plan actually speak to the ANC's recent plan, this one entitled Reconstruction, Growth and Transformation, Building a New Inclusive Economy, in terms of synergies between these plans, especially because the ANC's plan is also about revitalizing the economy?
To a large extent, the presentation by the President reflects the objectives set out in our document. You will recall that we also privilege infrastructure development as a priority in order to kickstart the economy. Because of its multiplier effects, for instance, I normally argue that if the construction business is busy, its impact, for instance, on engineering manufacturing is strong. 40% of manufacturing in that sector is consumed by construction. So, also, construction employ what I call the least skilled workers, and for that reason, it becomes the appropriate instrument for the unemployed. If you recall the figures released by State AC, 54% of the unemployed are basically have less than matric.
Talk to some of the reaction that came out yesterday, and it pretty much so echoes what you're telling us now, is that the ANC's economic document was basically dubbed as nothing new, that this is all things that have been there, but they were very poorly executed. And, you know, they kind of say that these were either poorly executed or not even planned for at all. I mean, what is going to be different this time? Why try and rehash what is already out there?
Our document is prefaced in the first place by highlighting a number of policy interventions over the past years which have been developed by the ANC. And then we then said we're not going to rehash those. All that we have done is to highlight key elements from those documents for immediate implementation. What that means is that our document was focused on implementation. And then we also make that point in the document. And the key aspect of that document also says we should increase coordination capacity in the presidents to achieve these implementation objectives.
Now, one of the big things, of course, is the reliance on the private sector, because, again, when we look at some analysis, we look at the coffers of government at the moment. This is something that government can't necessarily be affording, especially when it comes to a lot of the promises made and those creation of 800,000 jobs, which people have got a very, very big question mark over, because jobs have been promised before, but unfortunately they don't come through. Let's talk to the reliance and the buy-in from NEDLAC and the private sector into this plan.
Let me just make this point that South Africa is a mixed economy. For that reason, you cannot say you are going to rely purely on government for job creation. The private sector has got a critical role to play. If you look, for instance, before COVID, we had about 16 million people employed. Only about close to 1.2 million were employed directly by public service. So generally, the bulk of the workforce is in private hands. So it is inaccurate to counterpose private and public in the context of job creation. Both of them have got to play a critical role. Let me just take, therefore, to the NEDLAC issue. The NEDLAC issue is again, take back to our document, one of the things we're raising in our document is social compacting, because it is our view that solution to the South African challenges, economic challenges, require a concerted effort by all South Africans. And therefore, the NEDLEC process was a strategic objective to achieve that.
You know, this again, Mr. Godongwana, brings in a lot of criticism, particularly from black big business, because they also again feel that it would be the same old, and they're at the mercy of the existing companies. And we'll take something like the Mooikloof plan as an example, is that there is just far too much power given to these companies, whereas the emerging companies are just not getting a slice of the pie because they just can't afford to.
Look, there are a couple of issues in this regard. You know, you've got multiple objectives at the same time. Some of them can be contradictory. On one hand, you want a speedy recovery, which the big business can deliver. On the other hand, you need to redress the imbalances of the past. So we are trying to navigate that kind of route. And we are in the process at the moment as the ANC to review whether the instruments were used for advancing black businesses are appropriate. And in this context, we'll be reviewing that and ensure that we move faster in changing the direction.
And one of the ways of doing this again is to local procurement. Now, I mean, this is the Accord of 2011, which basically prioritized locally manufactured goods, and this is something that is vital to the strengthening of the economy, and not particularly rely on something like a lot of imports coming from China, but rather procure and buy locally. So talk to us about this. I mean, South Africa spends billions on imports. How do we keep that money back home and make manufacturing and investment in those skills here in South Africa that we can buy our own products?
We have been urging for the past few years that we need to intensify localization of procurement. Look, of course, you can't procure everything local. It must be procuring those areas where South Africa does not have competencies. There are very areas, I can tell you, even in Eskom, South Africa has got the capability to produce boilers. So what that means is that there's what we need to design is not policy, because we do have policy, is our instruments of enforcing a localization. Past the president's speech, that should be our focus, because even state-owned enterprise sometimes don't comply. So what we need to do is to we're exploring our instruments to enforce localization.
I mean, you know, one of the great things I read yesterday coming out of this, and I'm just taking one example, and that would be in the clothing industry. I'm seeing that one of the groups, the Fushini group, has said that they are now making a policy to procure 35% of their complete product line from South Africa, not necessarily going the China route, but making sure that at least 35% of it is locally manufactured and bought here. I mean, this should be something that should be considered almost an obligation when it comes to a lot of retailers, is to make sure that they procure a lot of their goods from South Africa. In fact, their target is 80% within the next 5 years. I mean, is this something that you could perhaps bring into policy when it comes to different companies, forcing them to buy local?
My understanding is that the Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister Patel, has been having a number of agreements with most of the retailers in that direction, which I think is an important aspect. It is our view that we should be procuring all of these things in South Africa. Where we cannot, we should encourage production of some of these things within the region. In other words, an approach which is regional, so we should procure, make this thing in South Africa. Where we cannot make them, we encourage we can't be competitive. We can encourage production of those things in the region.
I just want to get to, we're going to be focusing on this a lot during the show, so I'm glad we've got you just to quickly set the tone going forward and get some reaction to it. I mean, you know, the President talked about this aggressive infrastructure drive to create jobs, but millions of people are not working. We know this. And part of the burden can be absorbed by SOEs as their developmental agenda mandate to create jobs, but they have been retrenching. Where are these jobs honestly going to come from?
You know, if you look at the approach in the President's recovery plan, there are a number of elements in it. The first one is realizing that the impact of COVID-19 is massive. And while employment is beginning to pick up since May after the easing of the restrictions, it has not eased up sufficiently enough. That's the reason why the first element is to provide income support in the form of the extension of the 350 rand or for another 3 months. That's one element to it. A second element to it is the mass employment. And that mass employment presupposes that we've got to focus on the massive people, massive unemployment of those who have been displaced in the job market. Now, that thing is proactively by government and is budgeted for. That's the second element of this stuff. The third element of this stuff is to stimulate demand by moving faster on infrastructure, which will have an impact on industrialization in itself, hence localization. So it's a multi-pronged intervention whose objective is to impact on unemployment.
All right, I'm going to leave it there for this morning. We thank you so much for your time, just for coming in, talking to us a little bit about this. That, of course, is Enoch Godongwana. He's the ANC head of economic transformation, talking to what the president announced yesterday. In the next hour, we're going to be getting a lot more analysis coming your way. We've got